I always get a lot of comments about farmers voting Brexit, and I thought today we'd talk about just that. Because there was a caller recently on LBC who is actually furious with David Cameron for offering the Brexit vote in the beginning. This guy actually voted Brexit and is furious about being given that vote by David Cameron now that he realises Brexit isn't what he wanted. And I think it's a fair thing to be angry with David Cameron for giving us this disastrous referendum. So have a listen to him first.
I think that you are blaming the Brexiteers for the situation we're in. Mm-hmm. But I think you should be pointing a finger at David Cameron for giving a people that don't understand the large scale of it a choice whether to vote or not.
Explain, Martin.
Well, he's basically given a people like myself a say about whether to stay in Europe or not.
Yep.
I voted out, not really understanding the magnitude of my decision.
Right.
I don't think he took it seriously that he would vote, that us as a people would vote out of Europe.
Well, I don't think he expected it, Martin.
Boris
didn't expect it.
Sorry?
He didn't expect it.
No,
Cameron was
he
in
didn't
shock.
Expect it.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And so he allowed Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage to run away with their sycophantic stories.
Yep.
And the people, like myself, I'll put my hands up, bought into it. And I have regretted it. When Donald Trump comes in, he is solely about America. And, you know, it would actually be quite refreshing if we had a government that would do the same for their people.
I think that a lot of, or too much focus goes into the referendum. It was advisory. It's just like an opinion poll. They happen all of the time. Every day there's a new opinion poll on something. Just because we went to the polling booths and ticked a box, it didn't change anything, unlike a general election, because we have a parliamentary system and that vote is mandatory, so it delivers a decision. It elects somebody. But with the referendum, it really was just a process of finding out how people think. But what the referendum does is it provides a scapegoat, because everybody's turning around and blaming each other. Farmers come in for an awful lot of stick. And the reason for that is the Brexit campaign were very good at harnessing fishing and farming. The Remain campaign didn't do anything on farming. Ridiculous, because the central policy of the European Union is food and farming. It is the founding principle of the European Union. After the war, that is the whole policy which actually solidified the European Union. And astonishingly, this week, it was GB News that actually wrote an article acknowledging this fact. And it's interesting how everyone gets everything upside down and confused. But the vote itself was advisory. We, the people, didn't vote to leave the European Union. And you know that because the High Court and the Supreme Court both ruled that no decision was made in the referendum. So we really must stop obsessing on that vote in 2016. All it did was provide a platform for the politicians to prepare the ground to leave the European Union, because somebody wanted to leave the European Union for whatever reason, a political experiment of some sort. But it isn't our fault. The main thing that actually solidified leaving the European Union was the 2019 general election when Boris Johnson was elected. And I seem to remember the most powerful reason for that happening was the fear of Jeremy Corbyn. And Jeremy Corbyn himself was a Brexiteer. So we were given such bad choices. And I was really interested about this because there's been some polling again done about particular choices around Brexit. And when you look at the differences in what people want in Britain, it becomes clear that actually we are united. And I think we always have been united in being a solidly left-of-centre country which supports its welfare state. But we've become divided by this referendum. And mostly it was because the people that believed in Brexit believed in their own version of Brexit. And now Brexit is here, and we've even had Nigel Farage saying that Brexit has failed.
Around 1 in 5 Leave voters regret it. The OBR forecasts a 4% hit to the economy over the medium to long term.
Don't make me laugh on
Hang
that.
on,
Yeah.
That's 40 billion in tax revenues.
Comical.
The UK economy is the only G7 economy not back to its pre-pandemic size. Business investment has lagged behind comparable economies. Economically, the UK would have been better staying in, wouldn't it?
I don't think that for a moment. But what I do think...
Based on all that?
But what I do think is we haven't actually benefited from Brexit economically when we could have done. I mean, what Brexit's proved, I'm afraid, is that our politicians are about as useless as the commissioners in Brussels were. We've mismanaged this totally. And if you look at simple things such as takeovers, such as corporation tax, we are driving business away from our country. Arguably, now we're back in control, we're regulating our own businesses even more than they were as EU members. Brexit has failed.
Back for you then?
Well, I wouldn't rule it out. It's not top of my bucket list, but frankly, we've not delivered on borders, we've not delivered on Brexit. The Tories have let us down very, very badly.
Brexit has not delivered what most people thought they hoped it would. And those of us that voted against it, it's easy for us because we were right. It's done what we thought it was going to do. In some cases, it's not as bad. In some cases, it's worse. So it depends on how you're examining it. But ultimately, when you boil it down to what the country wants, and this is the important bit now, because we are facing the biggest choice in Brexit, which is whether we do an American trade deal, which will have fundamental impact on our lives. And when you look at that, actually, we are united. The majority do not want the American trade deal. Only 17% back the American trade deal. And I'm sure that once the campaign gets going and people understand what the trade-offs of that American trade deal are, that more and more people will actually turn against it. And this is why it's a really interesting point at which we're at, because Mandelson and Farage are going to go over to America and try and do a deal with Trump. And I think that's politically got to be one of the most difficult things that has ever been sought. We know what happened to Tony Blair when he made the decision with George Bush to do the Iraq war, once people again understood that it wasn't what they thought it was. But I think we eventually come back and retract into our core values, which are centred around post-war policy, which is centred around the European Union, because we are in Europe. And ultimately, that's what we have to remember. We need to stop blaming voters. And so I really hope that people stop saying to me, you got what you voted for, you reap what you sow, because A, I didn't vote for it. B, anyone that did vote for Brexit, we can see from this polling by UK in a Changing Europe that it shows fundamentally that whoever voted Brexit, most of them voted for lies and myths and fantasies. And you can't blame the voters for that. You can only blame the politicians who missold it. And absolutely, I blame David Cameron for giving the vote in the first place when the 2015 election was won and I realised the Conservatives had won. My first thought was, oh God, we're going to have to go through a referendum. I knew it was going to be a very, very difficult reality, that immigration was going to be harnessed. And that's exactly what happened. Immigration, scapegoating of the EU, creating fantasies, everything's going to be better, because everyone was offered a change and things weren't that great with austerity. So of course people voted for change. Yes, the people who bear the most responsibility for where we are, David Cameron for offering the vote, David Cameron for running away with his tail between his legs, Theresa May for not having enough power and strength and courage to bat Brexit into the long grass by doing something like a royal commission to discover what Brexit meant. She easily could have done that. Instead, she decided to try and throw the dice and get a bigger majority, thinking that she was going to be Prime Minister for the next decade. And so that was her fault, and then she failed to get her fudge of a deal through Parliament. And then Boris Johnson, who only cares about Boris Johnson, which is why he went for the Brexit, which was scorched earth to keep the lunatics in his party happy. And then around all of this is Nigel Farage, who's gone on for years about Brexit being the answer to our prayers, and how on earth no one holds him to account for that, I don't know. I hope I can appeal to you to not blame voters. If you feel sore about Brexit, write to David Cameron, write to Theresa May, write to Boris Johnson, write to Keir Starmer, write to your MP, but don't blame voters.
Truths is probably being a little kind to the kind of nonsense that the Boris Johnson government was spouting about Brexit.
Were you ready to leave the political situation happening in the UK? You'd resigned, hadn't you, from your position as Brexit counsellor at the British Embassy in Washington. You resigned in 2019 because you were concerned, as you said at the time, about half-truths and not totally honest messages being delivered to British citizens about Brexit. You'd left that behind. Is it sort of fair to say that you were ready to move on politically as well from the UK to the United States?
Took a little while for me to make that transition. And by the way, as a diplomat, I tend to pick my words very carefully. So half-truths is probably being a little kind to the kind of nonsense that the Boris Johnson government was spouting about Brexit. Now
How
that
would
I'm
you
no
describe
longer
it now?
a
Go
diplomat,
on. Yeah.
willful disinformation and suppression of relevant information for businesses and farmers and fishing communities and people who've been affected very badly by Brexit. And I do want to make it clear that I didn't resign because I thought it was, my decision to say that Brexit per se was not right. It isn't illegal or immoral to want to leave the EU, but it is unethical to lie about the consequences and willfully deceive the British public and our allies in America, where I was representing Britain at the time, and willfully try and pull the wool over their eyes about the consequences of Brexit. And that was what pushed me over the edge, because it's incompatible with the civil service code of requiring integrity and honesty. But no, I mean, I really loved the UK. I didn't anticipate that this is where I would end up. But I had a kind of awakening after I had left the Foreign Office, and I was reflecting back on what had happened in the UK. And I realised that Brexit was a symptom of a far deeper malaise within British society, that actually government was not functioning very well, that there was a very unholy system of patronage and cronyism between politicians, the press, most of which are owned by very wealthy owners who don't even base themselves in the UK, and unfortunately also the palace. So you introduced me as a small R Republican. I mean that in the sense that I no longer believe that we should have a royal family. And it's not because I have any dislike for the individual members of the royal family. I appreciate that they are a symbol of the country, they are historical continuity, and many of them try to do very good works. But they are a kind of albatross on the UK modernising and entering the modern age. And as long as we have a royal family, we can't get rid of the House of Lords. And it's a nonsense in today's age that we have inherited peers sitting in the House of Lords.
Yeah, and
it's a nonsense that politicians can nominate cronies to become members of the House of Lords.
So you paint a picture there, really, broadly, of an undemocratic system. And I was going to ask you what you make of the new Labour government, whether they're operating as you expected them to, whether the system will change under Labour or whether it will just simply continue as it is.
Well, I just saw that the government has issued a reply to a petition to consider introducing proportional representation. And their reply was that they were not convinced there was a case for it. So I think if the system is seen to work for them, they will stick with it. I have to confess that I think ethically, this government will be a more competent and ethical government than its predecessor, although that's a pretty low bar given how much the Boris Johnson government was scraping the barrel by the end of its tenure. I do think the fuss over Labour leaders accepting freebies, it's not on the scale of the corruption that dominated the Conservative government, but nevertheless, it's also problematic. That is not appropriate by any government. I'm just really disappointed that this government is still shying away from levelling with the British public about where we are on Brexit. I mean, we've just seen these I'm in the US now, but I've been following the news coverage, for example, of the farmers' protests. And I'm sympathetic to farmers who are worried about losing their livelihoods. But on the other hand, what's hit farmers really hard is that they can no longer get seasonal workers to pick their crops, and they can no longer trade as easily into the EU.
Yeah. And their subsidies
we've
have
negotiated
been cut and not replaced
exactly.
properly, the EU subsidies.
And these are things that need to be honestly discussed, but there remains a conspiracy of silence within the British system that is scared to have an honest conversation with the British public, most of which, by the way, are now coming to understand the full implications of the Brexit deal that Boris Johnson negotiated.
Why are we scared then to have that discussion? I think there's definitely a Brexit malaise. I think a lot of people think it's done, it's decided. We just need to now look at how we deal with this in the best possible way. Forget about the secrets that were kept. Forget about the misinformation surrounding it. You call it willful disinformation. Is it a conspiracy of silence, or is it just cracking on with it because we've got no choice now? Yes, we can make tweaks when the next Brexit deal comes up, and Starmer will do that as we understand it. But broad sweeping changes, no, too late.
Well, it may be too late because it's also possibly the case that the EU won't be willing to make significant changes because actually they got by far the better end of the deal. The trade deal that was negotiated has given the EU far better access to our market and made our goods far harder to enter their market. So it's kind of a good outcome from their point of view. I don't know what is guiding the current Labour government. I don't have an in with them. My observation is it's political caution because they were worried about turning off people who were tired of Brexit or who had supported Brexit. But I think they're a little bit behind the curve, personally. And since they have said that growth is their prime mantra, economic growth, you can't have economic growth if you are negotiating with one hand tied behind your back and cutting off trade to your largest trading partner, which remains the EU. So yes, they can get tweaks to the deal, but that's not going to change the fundamental situation.
Let's talk about the political situation in the United States there and really the assessment, the feeling of the American people, those people you've been talking to before and after the election. You did some campaigning, didn't you, for Kamala Harris?
Yeah, so here again, I'm on a continual learning journey, and I have to acknowledge that having lived in the US on and off for 20 years, juggling with my time in the UK, I have come to understand why voters are angry with the status quo. And so the risk with voting for Kamala Harris is you were going to get more of the status quo, and a lot of people are unhappy with that. And so that has caused me to reflect on why perhaps so many people voted for Brexit. I don't think Brexit was the solution to the UK's problems, but I can understand more now.